Okay, class. Today we're going to look at analyzing graphs. If you can please pay attention, get out a sheet of paper, and you might want to get out your circle map that we created a long time ago talking about relation in the center. Please get that circle map out. You're going to add a little bit of notes to it. All right? And today's going to be the last day you'll add notes to that circle map. So do me a favor, get your circle map out. We're going to pause. And we are going to go ahead and take a look at analyzing graphs. Sometimes you will have a given graph and be asked to describe the situation that would relate to that graph. For example, look at the graph below. Jack is going to school. He walks and takes 2 buses. Describe the trip to school. Make sure you pay close attention to the vertical axis that says distance and the horizontal axis that says time. Here I labeled each part of Jack's movement from 1 through 5. Each number matches with the graph. Number 1, as you can see on the graph, Jack walks to the school bus stop. Notice he's going up in his walking distance. Then step 2, he waits for the bus. So look at number 2 on the graph. Notice it's flat, no movement, right? Notice the distant part is not showing going up or down. There's no movement. It's flat. But the time moved. All right. Next, number 3. He takes the first bus. Compare 3 and 1. Notice how number 3 goes up really steep compared to number 1. Because he's on a bus. He's moving quicker. All right. Next, then number 4. Look at number 4 and look at number 2. Those are both waiting times. But he waited a longer time at number 2 compared to number 4. All right. Notice in number 4, just like number 2, they're both waiting. Their time is waiting. And lastly, number 5. He catches the bus again. And he goes directly to school. And that's the end of the story in that graph. Did he have a longer wait for the first bus or the second bus? Now, remember, the first bus is when he waited was at number 2. And the second bus when he waited was at number 4. So the answer there is the first bus, because it is a longer line on the x-axis compared to the number 4. All right? What was the first or second bus a longer trip? Excuse me. Was the first or the second bus a longer trip? Now remember, the first bus is number 3 and the second bus is number 5. Actually, the first bus was a longer trip. As you can see, the y-axis line as it goes up is longer in number 3 than in number 5. All right. So now you have a basic understanding of how graphs can describe movements between 2 different things, an input and an output, right? So let's look at another graph. This graph relates to studying for a test and actual scores. Match the scenario with the point on the graph. Let's take a look at scenario number 1. Jenna didn't study but did fine on the test. Which one of those points, A, B, C, D, or E, shows the time that Jenna studies? Now look at the y-axis, up and down axis. That's the time for study. And look at the test scores, which is the x-axis. All right? So which one of those describe basically no study time but a great test score? Point E describes that. Let's take a look at number 2. William studied a long time but did poorly on the tests. Now look at the study time. Read the question and look at the study time. Study time is the vertical axis. So A shows a long study time but a really poor study outcome, which is the test score. Okay? Next, let's look at 3. Alfredo studied some and passed the test. So Alfredo studied some midway, but still made a good passing score. So that's about C. All right, and lastly, number 4, Ingrid studied hard and did well on the test. So that means Ingrid studied a lot. That means the amount on the y-axis should be up top. And then she did well on the test, so that the amount on the x-axis should show a large amount too. So the answer there has to be D. Okay? Make your own scenario that fit a point and write it down on your own sheet of paper using the grid below, or example number 1 through number 4. Now open up your math textbook, numbers, page 127, and you're going to follow along with me as I review example number 1 and example number 2. So we're going to pause right now as you open up your math textbook to page 127. Okay, on page 127, it's talking about matching situations from a table with certain descriptions. Okay, so the table gives the speed of 3 snowboarders in miles per hour at a given time during a race. Tell which snowboarder correspond to each situation. So take a look at the graph. Snowboarder number 1, snowboarder number 2, and snowboarder number 3. It says Jordan gets off to a good start and continues through the course by picking up speed. Which one of those scenarios represents Jordan? Is Jordan snowboarder number 1? Is he snowboarder number 2? Or is he snowboarder number 3? Jordan is actually snowboarder number 3. Why? If you take a look at snowboarder number 3, and based on what the scenario said up top, okay, he gets a good start and continues to pick up speed. That means the number needs to keep going up. So as you can see, snowboarder number 3 started off at 16, and the speed kept going up. It went up 19, then it went up 22, then it went up 25, then it went up 27. Next, Ethan gets off to a good start and pick up speed. Towards the end of the race, he nearly falls. He rights himself and finished the race, reaching his greatest speed. Okay, so our other two choices, snowboarder number 1 and snowboarder number 2. Ethan is actually snowboarder number 2. Let's look at the speeds. He started off to a good start. He kept going. Then he went from 15 to 18. That's an increase. Then he went from 18 to 22. That's an increase. But if you recall, it says that Ethan had a fall. So that means if you had a fall, your speed is going to go down, right? So he had a fall, so he went from 22 to 19. But then he said Ethan had a great finish. That means he finished faster than how where he left off at. So if we go from 19 to 24, that shows the great finish. So Ethan has to be snowboarder number 1. Next, Xavier gets off to a good start, but falls around the middle of the race. He gets up and finished the race, gaining speed through the finish line. So he got up, had a good start, but then he falls off. And so by default, we know it's going to be snowboarder number 2. But look at the numbers. At 6, he started off at 17, and he went up to 20, but falls off. That means completely falls off the bike. So his speed stops, right? So then he has to get up back on the bike, starting from 0 up to 15, and then he eventually finished up the race. Okay, so that's the explanation for our example number 1. Now, using our same examples from before, we're going to look at them from a table to a graph. Remember, I said to you guys, all of these go together. The table is one representation. The graph is another representation. Okay, so you should be able to look at a table, figure out what's going on. You should be able to look at a graph, figure out what's going on. But look at the graphs. The graphs give you a better picture, right? Obviously, the graphs are a picture, like I've said before. You can look at a graph and see exactly what's going on. Whereas the table, it took us a little bit longer to figure out what was going on. But looking at the looking at the graph, you can see the scenario. It talks about snowboarder number 1, the racer speed. Racer number 1 is actually snowboarder number 3, The graph number 1 is snowboarder number 3. And the reason why is because we know it's a continuous increase in speed. Look at the graph. It's keep going up. And graph number 2 is actually snowboarder number 1, where we talked about how snowboarder number 1 kind of fell off a little bit, but then he got back up on speed, and he stumbled a little bit and got back up on speed and eventually finished out the race great. Whereas snowboarder number 2, my bad. Snowboarder number 2 fell off the bike. So if you notice the graph, when you start off the race, you start off at 0-0, right? And then you pick up speed. But then if you fall off the bike, guess what's going to happen? You're going to go back to 0 and then eventually pick up speed. So that's why we know that graph number 3 is actually snowboarder number 2. All right? Okay, now you're going to do classwork. Grab your math textbook, open it to page 129 to page 130, and you're going to complete numbers 1 through 9 on your own. This is due at the end of class.